So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I actually pressed record after I did a full introduction of NENA, but it doesn't matter. My name's Dr. Michelle Maloney, and I'm the co-founder and one of the directors of the New Economy Network Australia. I've acknowledged country and given a brief overview of NENA. But what I'd like to do now is actually hand over to Sarah Motta, one of the co-founders of our very excellent and very important Women in the New Economy Hub. So Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce the session and to run through what you're going to share with everybody today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for all the holding of this wonderful organisation and of the spaciousness to be able to develop these kind of different foci on what does it mean to think through and put into practice and name and make sense of new economies. I'm Sarah Motta, and I'm an Indigenous mestiza woman with Latin American and European lineages. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I meet, which is at where it's an estuary point where fresh and salt waters meet of the Awabakal and the Warramai peoples, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emergent. And of course, any other Indigenous people here today, and honouring the continuing wisdoms and custodianship of First Nations people of these lands. And also invoke quite centrally the matriarchal lineages and their strengths as they continue with survivance and sovereignty. As they continue with survivance and sovereignty and guide, a guiding light for us in our hub, and are always the anchor. También quiero convocar las energías de las abuelas, ¿no? Para que nos acompañen hoy día y nos ayuden a trenzar un diálogo de profundidad y compasión y sutileza también, ¿no? And so in the Women in the New Economy Hub, we have basically been going for about a year. And we began, and it's women and women identifying, and we began really by sharing our stories, both of what we're doing in all these different ways that we are engaged with creating new social economies, which are attentive to care, country and community. And also in unpacking and trying to find a shared language across our differences to make sense of what it might mean to think about feminizing or feminist economies without erasing difference, and seeing difference and diversity as at the heart of actually what a feminist or feminized decolonizing economy as language and as practice and as, I guess, strategy and as embodiment might look like. And so through our stories and kind of dropping in with each other, we've met most months, but during some of the lockdown we haven't. We've also kind of identified themes that were really important for us. And one of the themes is housing and the incredibly gendered nature of the housing crisis and precarity, but also the incredible stories and histories of women-led, in the broadest sense of women-led, alternatives to privatized, individualized forms of kinship and home and belonging. And so that's been a theme that we've been mapping, and I got a little bit of money, and so somebody's been, Robin, she's not here today, been kind of mapping this intersectional gendered map of gendered precarities in housing, but also feminized alternatives. And another theme that's emerged is the need to actually develop an intersectional reading of the current challenges that women and feminized people in plurality face in order to enable them to contribute to new economies. So not just precarities, but also when they're engaged with new institutions, new sets of ideas, new practices of well-being, what kinds of particular gendered challenges do they face? But also on the other side, to make sense of and bring visibility to the knowledges and the wisdoms that women in their plurality bring, and maybe expand and deepen our vision of economy to well-being, to social economy, to new set relationships of kin and belonging and connection and homecoming between human and more than human and non-human. And so our last meeting, we were like, oh, we'd really like to do something. What can we do? Like, it'd be really nice to do something before the end of the year. And what struck us was the diversity of our work. And that really, when we're looking at feminized or feminist economies and economic practices and visioning, that there's a bit of a critique of the idea that we need experts distant from our lived experience to make sense of that. And that really, I think June Jordan said it, and I've used it in some of my own work, we are the ones we've been waiting for. So we were like, well, instead of like asking other folk, why don't we just see who in this hub would actually like to share their work, which is so amazing and rich, and share that as a way for us to think about this really intense political economic conjuncture, where obviously increasing forms of polarization are emergent. And some of that is going towards economies and polities of well-being, and some of that is going towards economies and polities of kind of neo-fascist, anti-feminized, racialized forms of politics. And so this is what we came up with, who wanted to participate. And the way that we're going to structure it today is we're going to have a kind of a round table set of 2 questions that our participants, who I'll tell you about in a minute, will talk about in terms of thinking about post-feminized, post-COVID futures, but also the present. And then we thought that there will be some time for questions and answers, but we also wanted to do a little bit of a breakout and a little bit of a Padlet to do some mapping with you, which for us is very much in line with our commitment to feminized, decolonized practices, that you in the audience are also kind of active participants in this process and active kind of knowers and creators. And so we thought that might be a nice thing to do for like 20 minutes or so. And we've got a Padlet link for you to share, and that folks can start talking to each other too and sharing knowledges and mapping together, and then to come back together and have a look at what we mapped. So I'm going to introduce you to the participants today. So we have Mifan Jordan, is the founder director of Grassroots Research Studio in Naarm, Melbourne. Her research focuses on gendered aging, mutualism, co-housing and women's labour. She's a strong advocate for subversive localism and post-growth economic organisation. And then our second speaker is Dr. Kamaljeet Sangha, has gained skills and knowledge in a transdisciplinary field of ecological economics for over the last 20 years. She has been extensively working with Indigenous communities across Northern Australia, especially on linking ecosystem services from rainforest and savanna ecosystems with the well-being of remote communities. And then we have Dr. Elizque Gonzalez, is an Indigenous woman from the Global South who holds a PhD in politics from the University of Newcastle and an MA in participation in politics from the University of Bradford. Her research interests are focused on polarisation, discourse policy analysis, and decolonial feminism. She is currently casual academic staff here at the Politics Group in the University of Newcastle. And our final speaker, Kumari Abediri, is a mother, a psychotherapist, and researcher who is passionate about co-weaving new economies of care which centre women's sovereignty and cultural knowing being. After having worked as an occupational therapist and psychotherapist for 2 decades in mental health services in London and Sydney, she now lives on Darug and Gundungura land in the Blue Mountains of so-called Australia, where she gathers mothers in her community and co-weaves containers of emergence which honour women's wisdom and sovereignty and provides counter-narratives to white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalistic Western biomedical hegemony. She is embarking on a PhD journey investigating mothers reconnecting with ancestral knowledge to improve their well-being, here with us at the University of Newcastle. And I'm really excited to be working with her on this process. So I'm going to begin with the first question, if that's okay to the 4 presenters. Okay, so the first question, you can go in any order that you're called to, that's fine, and we can change the order for the second one too, whatever you feel comfortable with. So what is your experience of how colonial patriarchal capitalism has devalued and or commodified women's bodies, labours and knowledges? Who wants to go first? You need to turn your mic on, Kamaljeet.
Sarah, can you repeat the question again?
What is your experience of how basically the current system, so the colonial patriarchal capitalism, has devalued and commodified women's bodies, labours and knowledges? Yeah, I can type the questions in the chat for sure. So who wants to go first with that? The four of you?
I think I can go first, just quickly, a couple of lines with this. Not that I'm a social scientist, but just observing what happens in this space and how we all feel it, and coming from my personal experience. And so please don't take me as a specialist in this space, but more as a person who believes in equality and someone who stands for equality, and who has seen it happening in, experienced in both developed and developing worlds, how we take it differently. So to me, was talking to my daughter yesterday. So she said she's in grade 8, getting into grade 8 now. And yesterday she heard a story from one of her classmates saying that there are boys in their classes who rate girls for their bodies. And to me, this has been very upsetting hearing that. So I started thinking it back of my school days, and I would never hear a thing like that. So it was, I'm originally from India. So that commodification of women bodies, it's our thinking, the whole market has developed in that space. We unintentionally kind of put ourselves in that space as well, to cope up with the society, that how we should be looking like, because we feel like we are judged by other people. So under that pressure, especially young girls, they get under pressure and they want to shape themselves as the world is going to like them. And there is no such pressure for males or boys in that space to the same extent as girls experience that. So listening to her story yesterday was, to me, was like, you need to be really strong enough to, stand under a pressure like this, where you're looking at your own classmates that you've been spending time and years with, and then ultimately, you feel this, that somebody is rating you. So to me, that's commodification and devaluing, what a child or as a human being you bring to your class. And it happens everywhere. And to some extent, some of us are responsible as well, because we don't stand for ourselves and we let the world to shape us. You look at the market, the type of clothes we wear, there is freedom to do whatever we want to do, but quite often it's done under pressure. It's not that I want to wear this and that's why I'm liking this, but quite often we wear it because, or we do things because we think the other person who's looking at us, we should be looking, nice, we should be looking smart. Probably, I believe not the same pressure, on males in that space. And when I think this, compare this with what happens in rural areas, especially in developed countries. I'm from a little village. From outside, we'll see women are not strong, but from inside, those women, they're quite strong in a number of ways, because they don't take this pressure of devaluing them, or they don't take this pressure of commodifying them. So they do things that they like, whether that's around the household. But quite often in feminism, we think that people, those from rural communities, that they don't have voice. But when you go into this inner systems, they do have strong voice there. And that's one thing that quite upset in the Western paradigm, which makes, there are lots of papers published in like feminism, economics, and all those kind of journals. And at one stage, I have to kind of say that I'm not reviewing these papers anymore, because what they project is that women in those rural villages, they don't have voice. And we want to bring, with a Western lens, that voice to that table. which is not true at all. You look at their social systems, how there's women play a role there. It's their leadership that tells, this is the family we are going to work with. This is the family we are not going to have a relationship with. They are the main decision makers there. So the role is very much complementary, which we don't understand in the Western world. I'm sorry to say this, but quite often we see with one lens and we think because they're not coming to the table when we are talking with some bigger decision making, say land ownership or things, and we think, well, women may not have a role there. But quite often that man can't take that decision by themselves. They have to go and talk with the family members, whether that's whosoever is there, whether that's the elder, maybe his elder mother. So he can't take that decision at his own. He has to talk with someone, and quite often women, strong women in the family, and say, I can't proceed this way because I've been, my family doesn't want this. So the hidden structures we don't see when we are doing that research with women in those rural communities. And we need to quite nicely actually understand from those women in rural settings how they stand for themselves and what are their, their own structures. And one thing that I really admire about them, like now looking at this question, they haven't commodified themselves in that space. So that's one lesson probably for us to discuss how we can take it on. Just an observation while thinking about this question. Nothing pre-planned in this space.
Lovely, thank you. So who would like to go next? Kumari. Brilliant.
I'm happy to go next. Thank you, Havmalat. I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, which is the Darug and Gundungara people, and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My experience of how women's bodies and labours and knowledges have been devalued and commodified, it's mainly been within the mental health system, both here in Australia and in the UK. So my experience, women presenting to the mental health, to mental health services are widely positioned as unknowing and in need of prescriptive guidance, of sort of controlling guidance from an all-knowing expert. And women aren't seen within the context of their rich cultural heritage. So over the last 20 years, I've seen care become so manualized, so time limited, so impersonal, that it actually perpetuates so many of the violations of the colonial, patriarchal, capitalist projects, which contributed to the psychosocial distress that women were presenting for help with in the first place. And then this overprivileging of the Western biomedical model and its implicit sort of fiscal constraints, it not only actually promotes the suppression of culturally imbued, sort of enfleshed knowledges in the women seeking help, but it also means that the health professionals who are providing help, so the psychotherapists and the doctors and the nurses, it's almost as if they also have to dissociate from their knowing being. So in the 20 years that I've worked in psychiatry, there's really no space to connect with ancestral knowledge or to connect with the land or to facilitate or sit side by side with the people who are coming to you for help as they do this. And it's as if the only useful tools we have are those of Western biomedicine. And there's no acknowledgement that colonialism has actually suppressed other healing knowledges in its attempt to actually sort of desecrate cultures and control colonized people for profit. So I've seen women from all over the world have their cultural traditions and their associated patterns of relating pathologized in psychiatric contexts to the further detriment of their mental health. And I've been complicit in these systems, you know, where women are treated so monolithically. And there's this tokenistic nod to their differing cultural background or their sort of sexual orientation or their family constellations. But actually, these things are invisibilized when it comes to offering treatment. And, you know, it doesn't matter where you come from or what you've been through, you know, it's the evidence base that matters. So you get 20 sessions of CBT for like bulimia nervosa, no matter what your needs are for ancestral connection with land. And, you know, so I've spent like 20 years in the mental health system, and, you know, I've pretended in this system that I haven't got experience that could be of benefit to the people that I work with, from living in my brown body, from living in a mixed race family, from my connection to ancestors, both like living and those who've passed. And I haven't been able to sort of facilitate these connections or to hold space for them in the mental health services. And so I was complicit in this until I no longer could be. And it was really, you know, after having a child that this sort of going from my head to my body, I felt I can't be complicit in these violations anymore. And so then I left both the NHS and then after coming to this country, left working in the private psychiatric sector to start to co-weave these different containers of emergence, started sort of gathering women so that they could bring all parts of themselves to the table. One of the things that sticks out in my mind is sitting in a multidisciplinary team meeting in London, and there was a young woman with anorexia nervosa, and she was from a Bengali family, and she was there with her mother for the ward round. And somehow it came up that the mother and the daughter, they were sharing a bed. And, you know, and this was really, it was the whole team were talking about how dysfunctional this was and how we had to help this adolescent to individuate. And, you know, intuitively, I felt that this was cultural, you know, like when my mother was alive, when I was unwell, I would share a bed with my mother. And yet there was no space for us to see what this young woman and her mother were doing. There was no space to see their sort of resilience and the gifts and how these family traditions might actually be part of the treatment plan as opposed to something to be pathologized. And so that's been my experience, and I can talk more about sort of how I've moved forward with that, you know, how I've moved forward with that in the next question. But thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think I can be this. Okay. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as the custodian of the land here, the Abubakar people, and pay my respect to all the other Aboriginal people today listening. My experience with patriarchal capitalism and this dominant way of treating women's bodies, especially after or during the COVID situation, has been basically an experience that started with me as a researcher. And this experience was most of the time invisible for me. I mean, as a researcher, I just want to understand what was happening in society. And I never thought that coloniality or feminism could help me to understand political ideas and political ideologies. And then I started to understand more what is happening by exploring coloniality and feminism. And for me, was like my eyes were opened, because I could see things that were more all the time invisible. So for me was the possibility of looking at the role of women in taking care of other people, the role of myself as a mother and wife, and exploring more and more what I couldn't see in the past as this kind of hierarchies that we see in society. So for me, especially, my interest was political polarization. I am from Venezuela, and the political polarization there was and has been very intense. And the hate between two groups at the beginning was the idea between communist and anti-communist, or authoritarian and pro-democracy. And this was like, this is the picture. However, when I started to see this more in depth, I could see that there are many of racial issues, many ideas related to the elite, who are those who have to govern the rest of the people. And when they started to feel attacked, then they reacted. So my question was, why is this happening? And why this is always the idea that white elite men are positioned as the rulers of society, and why women, why indigenous people, why racialized people have to be always in this position of governed and being governed. And for me was just the idea that in Venezuela, we have a long history of racism, even though this is not visible. And basically, when I explored my life in Venezuela before coming to Australia to do my PhD, was like, the racism doesn't exist. And this idea of feminism is just awkward. Most of the time I thought, no, this is, women have to do what they have to do. They have to study. In Venezuela, if you don't study, you don't get a good job. Basically, then you live in conditions of poverty, but you also have to marry, you also have to be a wife and take care of home. This is a responsibility for women. And then the discussion about how women can think about other ways, how poor people can think about other forms of democracy, how these issues get in tension with other ways of understanding how society can be, create tensions. And these tensions create hate, and hate creates then this pernicious polarization in which people are just being in opposite sides without dialogue. And maybe this is my connection to the second question, because I see in the colonial feminism, and I can see in creating dialogues between people by recognizing the role of, not the role, but recognizing the knowledge of people from the South, indigenous people, Black people, people who have been excluded. By recognizing their knowledge, we can introduce more dialogue. And this dialogue is possible to have it with listening, and we have to be open to listen the other. So this is my answer to this question.
Thanks so much, Biscay. Oh, I seem to have lost it. Bear with me.
Sharon just had to leave for a moment. So, Hufan, are you happy?
I am happy, yes, and I want to start as well just by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm on today, which I'm in Melbourne, and I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, who speak the Woiwurrung language in Banyul, which is an Indigenous word for hill. And I also wanted to pay my respects to my co-panelists. I think I'm the only Australian-born woman here, so it's a real privilege to be here and talking to you and learning with you. Just for the audience, I'm a cisgender white woman, older woman, and I also want to acknowledge, as Michelle did earlier, and I think Sarah did as well, that we include trans feminine women in this discussion and respect their experiences very much. So I guess from my point of view, every discussion by my co-panelists has had me frantically writing little notes and sparking off fireworks of interest, but I guess I come at it from a slightly different perspective. So I started out really looking at aging and aged advocacy, and very quickly through that became interested in what I call gendered aging. And we talked before about our kind of shared concerns about housing outcomes and the role of property and ownership and et cetera for women, and how that particularly impacts in older age. So in Australia, women over 45 are now the cohort most at risk of homelessness. As I'm sure you know, single women in particular are very prone to poverty in older age and lack of care. Women live longer, but we do that with more chronic illnesses and diseases to manage, so it's not necessarily all good. I also want to acknowledge, of course, that for many men, the kind of colonial patriarchal systems that we live and work within are also difficult, particularly men of Indigenous background, non-English speaking background, LGBTIQ plus and other categories, particularly people living with disability is another area. So just to give you a bit of a background about some recent research I've done, which really sort of is around this topic. It was a research project which covered 12 months from the start of COVID in Australia in March 2020 till around about March 2021. And it was exploring outcomes for women over 40 who are considered older in terms of a labour cohort, because a lot of the focus before then, and there had been talk about the pink recession and the she-cession, and the burden of women who had to remotely school, particularly primary school age children. So there was a focus originally on youth losing their jobs and students who work in the more casualised sectors of hospitality, retail and so forth. And so there was a focus on young people, and then a focus particularly on young women, the extreme risk of family violence, higher incidence of anxiety in relation to COVID. So Grassroots started out on a research study called Generation Expendable, ? Older women in the pandemic economy. And the methodology was a kind of broad-based survey attracting women. And then from that, sort of self-identified interviews. So just to give you a bit of a breakdown, the outcomes for older women were very much framed. Well, the analysis was framed under something we call the dual discriminations, which some of you may have heard of, but they're used in a number of contexts. But in this particular context, they refer to how women over 40 are more likely to experience sexism in the workplace and ageism in the workplace. And they both that goes very much back to the question around the kind of commodification of women and the kind of traditional focus on women's bodies and attractiveness as giving women value. So it's seen that as you're older, you potentially become less visible, less attractive. And so those discriminations in the workplace, they're subtle. They're most exposed through job seeking. So when you're trying to get jobs, you may get an interview on paper, but as soon as people turn up and see you then people have experienced some quite terrible things, and we heard some terrible stories as part of the research, but also in other ways. So for example, because you might be working part-time, you don't have those opportunities to career build and build networks in the workplace. You're not offered the training because you're not seen as a kind of a safe bet. And obviously women have, as we've already touched on and we'll talk a lot more about, you know, the kind of care commitments often at home to balance, and older women, those quite typically involve children, teenage children, dependent siblings, and also aging parents. So you get that between 40 and 65 in particular is that what we call the sandwich carer cohort. So the survey and interviews looked into that really, and I guess there were 3 areas we looked at. So we looked at the kind of circumstances of work, so whether women lost jobs or changed place of work. So those were the most sort of common things. At the conditions of work and how they changed within COVID under the pandemic and the particular stresses, and also around work culture. So I can share a link to the full research piece later if people are interested. But in a nutshell, I guess the findings were that about a fifth of older women lost their jobs, and the older they were, they faced more extreme barriers to getting a new job. Many had to kind of go into retirement. The second really kind of clear finding was around the conditions of work. So I would say a majority of women participating worked in the so-called feminized sectors, or the kind of commodified care, as I think of it, of community care, primary care, healthcare, and education. So that would have made up, I would say, over 3/4 of the respondents to the survey, worked in those sectors. And I would say 30% of them, after kind of changes to place of work, the next most common experience they had experienced was changes to health and safety and occupational health and safety risk during COVID. And some of the stories around that were terrible, ranging from things you would have read in the mainstream news about, personal protective equipment. So, for example, and there were similar issues for males and essential workers who are men. So it wasn't particularly gendered, but for example, a lot of the personal protective equipment had been designed for adult males and didn't even fit women. So when you think that over 90% of the primary healthcare sector is females, and I think it's about 48% of them are over 45. So at that older age, more at risk of COVID. So, there were some really key issues, and I think, you will no doubt remember there was a lot of debate about the safety of sending children to school and about essential workers being able to continue to work and childcare being provided, but there was very little public discussion about how we were going to protect teachers, how we were going to protect health workers. That seemed to come later. And I guess the final and really for me the key finding of the research was that the respondents in the survey were given 2 sets of definitions, one from Australia's Fair Work Commission around workplace bullying behaviours. So these are kind of patterns of treatments of behaviour that, if and where ongoing, can constitute workplace bullying. And also another set of definitions based on a UK study into the National Health Service, which was a bit more detailed. But very interesting, considering we had a high number of healthcare workers as respondents in the survey. Anyway, I guess the telling result was that more than 50% of women participating, and it was a small survey. We only had just over 150 respondents, so it's a snapshot. It's not meant to be a full-on kind of quantitative study, but they had experienced that behaviour. For many of them, the seeds were there pre-COVID, and things were highly exacerbated under COVID with far greater workplace burden, huge occupational health and safety risks, So, you know, all those additional pressures at home. So the burden of work at home. And I guess it was those two things that really fascinated me, the kind of, you know, how we commodify caregiving and women's reproductive labour and how we treat that in the workplace, and then the kind of invisibility of it in the home. So even though some women shifted to working from home with their often male partners and perhaps teenage children, the burden of labour still fell to the women, even though everybody was there. And I can personally vouch for that. So yes, I think, you know, one of the standout things for me, which I'd really love to hear from other people today, was that was really the finding that most of the women were bullied by other older people, so people over 40. Over half of those were women, and younger women as well. So there was this real, you know, woman on woman, what one described as kind of constant white anting, gaslighting, toxic workplace, competition, and that, you know, that really signaled to me that, you know, that you know, just how that goes against the concepts of feminine labor that we think about and that we traditionally held, and that, you know, the kind of the essence of patriarchal capitalist colonialism really is about the fragmentation of relationships and collectives, and about competing, and what it has done perhaps in those you know, feminized like education and healthcare. Those feminized sectors are highly institutional, and they're highly linear and hierarchical, and in some ways they you know, they pit women against each other in a so-called meritocracy and seek to individualize and increasingly deunionize and kind of challenge those notions of sisterhood. And yeah, I guess I will leave that there for now.
Thank you, everybody. So I'm juggling my young son who's ill today at work. So that's my in and out. So I'm actually enacting these social reproductive labours as we speak. So as we can see, we're beginning to flesh out. These are the kinds of discussions we have, right, and mappings in our hub. So from when we give a women's lens, and a women's lens in an intersectional, complex way, then we start to think about the economy in such broad, multidimensional levels. So we bring to presence whose gaze is naming when a woman is oppressed or not. What can be learned from social economies and complementarities in gendered relationships from the South? What does it mean when we think it from a feminist or feminized perspective on economies, when we include well-being and mental health and social relationships? And how does the biomedical system somehow reproduce disempowerment? And so what does that mean to flip that script, which we move to? And flip that script also with an intersectional lens that takes seriously ancestrality and culture and context and plurality. And then what does it mean to recognize from one's own experience with the Biscay as, oh, it's kind of white bourgeois subjects who are governing, and it's the race and feminized, so men and poor Black women who are governed. And what does it mean when you go back to those lineages and histories and knowledges that have been dismissed? What can be learned? And then finally with MIFAM, which brings us right here, right, to the feminized nature of the impacts of COVID, prior to COVID, and then how they're accentuated with feminization of poverty and precarity and invisibilization of social reproduction, and then the complexities of how this system can also divide women against each other. So these are some of the things, right, that we also want to explore with you, or would love to hear from you. And we're going to move to the second question now. So I am going to look at the comments. I haven't done this yet because I've been juggling child who's sick and trying to listen. But I will write the second question into the chat, because this moves to, okay, so what do we vision now then? Because we don't want to get stuck. So our thing is, we don't want to stuck just naming power. We want to tell our stories and how we're intertwined with them as embodied feminized people, but we also want to vision these alternatives and try to think strategically about how these we can put this into practice or nurture each other with what we're already doing. So the second question to the four panelists are, what are your visions for new feminized or decolonized economies that value women's labours and knowledges in a post-COVID world? And there's a second part which you can engage with as much as you want. And how do we ensure that these visions are centred in our political strategies as opposed to excluded and devalued and kind of added on as an add-on? So I'm going to write that in the chat, and then I will look at some of the comments that have been given. And I think
yes, excuse me, Sarah, just while our speakers are contemplating the questions and issues, Maggie Hall has said she doesn't feel comfortable that the two men attending this meeting have their cameras off. Therefore, I'm unable to experience this meeting without feeling comfortable. Is this a safe space? I just wanted to draw that to your attention as facilitator. There are two questions so far, which I've put into my list of questions.
Okay, well, so I'm writing this down. So I'll talk to Maggie in the chat in a second and talk to you about this and try and explore with you what would be maybe a solution to this, but also enable the speakers to continue. How do we ensure? Because obviously we want everybody to feel safe. So I think the first thing I will I'll have a little chat with you and see. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to hand over to the speakers and then for you to continue in whichever order you would like to continue.
So I'll start answering that question just while Sarah is dealing with that, so we don't waste any time. So I guess as Sarah started that conversation about well-being, I guess if we start valuing well-being, we will develop strategies that help us to understand women's role in the society, including their knowledge, the multifaceted approach that they bring to the table. I'm experiencing more and more of that because more you talk with women, quite often many of us, we think from different perspectives, and we do bring to the table, new perspectives, which if you think you're sitting in, whether that's pre or post COVID situation, if you're sitting in a, on a table dominated by one side, especially male, and it's usually just one opinion that gets across. So there is a lot of research now that shows that women do bring different perspectives. And how do we kind of all become active in this space? I think that's my question. We understand that we do bring different perspectives. How do we take our voice to the table saying these perspectives are important? So one of the things that I've been kind of thinking in this space is after Industrial Revolution, a lot of the work has been in men's hands, especially in the Western world. And that's where our economy has been skewed to this GDP-based measures. So you look at Australia's economy, and many other Western countries' economies, we measure each other's progress against GDP, which is the gross domestic product. If we shift the notion of those economies to well-being based economies, which is how satisfied we are the way we are leading our lives, then this whole picture for the economy changes, where we start respecting women's knowledge, we start respecting and valuing their skills, which sit in many disciplines, many areas, whether you are looking after children, looking after parents, being a part of the society where we all feel like contributing at least something, and bringing these multiple perspectives. Quite often we don't actually value that, because I think that's a lot of that knowledge is inherited, or it's, I would say, genetics play a bit of role there. that many of us do think from different perspectives, while some may not. But if we start valuing those perspectives, we can change the way we want to shape our economy. And to me, that focusing on that well-being side of the economy can help us to bring that shift in this. So I'll end there before extending it too much. So Mif and Kumari and Dibraski can say something further.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you. So I'm happy to go next. So if I sort of take you back to my journey sort of changing, so from feeling that I was complicit in this system, and how I stopped being complicit was I left the NHS and the private psychiatric sector here. And what I started to do was to gather women, so mainly mothers, in my local community on Darug and Gandangara land here in the Blue Mountains. And we gathered in people's homes and we gathered in the bush. We gathered to co-weave containers of emergence that were far more equitous and egalitarian and honouring and witnessing of women than the formal psychotherapeutic or clinical groups that I've been accustomed to over the past 2 decades. Sometimes we call these gatherings circles, sometimes we call them workshops, other times they weren't named as anything. And we made sure that they were accessible to all women in terms of, some of them, if there were costs to be covered, say, for example, venues, it was pay what you can, but most of the time, these sort of gatherings were just women coming together to help themselves and each other, and there wasn't sort of a fiscal constraint. And in these spaces, we acknowledged the Indigenous custodians of the land and the land's innate wisdom. We acknowledged our foremothers and the parts of ourselves which we didn't always feel safe to show in more sterile, prescriptive Western clinical settings. And women shared their stories and they listened to each other deeply. There were babies held in laps or older children playing together and being looked after collectively, or women co-created ways of looking after each other's children outside of the gatherings to afford women the space to be able to meet their own needs for a while. And women were honoured for all their difference. So there weren't brown and yellow and black bodies trying to fit into white protocols. There weren't queer bodies and single mothers' bodies trying to fit into heteronormative protocols. Women who were facing housing precarity, atop gendered violence, weren't having to take just one difficulty or one symptom to a specialised service. People were able to come with all that was going on for them, and they were able to be witnessed. And it was so important that in these gatherings, women were able to share from a position of power as knowing beings who, yes, required support, but women weren't seen as symptoms, just needing condescending, sort of prescriptive help from the cult of the expert. And what we saw was that women healed. They healed on their own terms. They self-defined their well-being. They didn't have to fit standardized, manualized diagnostic criteria, which wasn't made with brown and black and yellow and queer bodies in mind. So over lockdown, when in Greater Sydney, there were restrictions that mandated only 2 people could walk together at a time, and it didn't acknowledge that there were single mothers at home with children, women in situations of domestic violence, women separated from extended family due to travel restrictions. A group of mothers, we met in the bush, so on Darug and Gandangara land, away from the capitalist, patriarchal, colonial gaze, deep in the bush in this subversive way. And we met weekly with the loose intention to provide biopsychosocial support to each other and our families. We looked after children and each other through the sharing of food and plant medicine, telling our stories, listening deeply, connecting to the land, sharing ancestral wisdoms. And we actually shared material things as well, so toys and household items with mothers who are in need. And sometimes we would bring each other's children so mothers could catch their breath. And perhaps most importantly, we didn't demand that women invisibilize or suppress parts of themselves which didn't fit the diagnostic criteria, or people didn't have to sit on waiting lists to get in and access this care and support. So we created a different economy of care where women were seen as sovereign and knowing, and their enfleshed cultural knowing was celebrated. And it was so much more egalitarian than any formal psychotherapeutic group I've been involved with over the last 2 decades. It included women from the South Americas, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, Australia, and the United Kingdom. It's important to note that it didn't include any First Nations mothers, and this is evidence of how First Nations mothers continue to be excluded, and how I am actually complicit in these violations on this stolen land. So I've just started the process of building relationships with First Nations cultural advisors to better understand how I can reach out to First Nations mothers in my local community, and how I can gather with First Nations mothers and learn from First Nations mothers in culturally sensitive ways. For the mothers who did gather, they were in a variety of living situations. Some were renting, some were in transitional housing, post-residing in domestic violence shelters. Others were homeowners. Some were working in retail. Some were teaching their mother tongue and doulaing whilst mothering. Some were actually on the front line, so there were midwives and teachers. Some were full-time mothering, and all were also homeschooling children. In this particular gathering over lockdown, all the women were university educated and in their 30s and 40s. Some were vaccinated, some were unvaccinated, others were ambivalent or unsure about vaccination, and all voices were valued as knowing. And there was no sort of overriding narrative, there was no push to get the unvaccinated to be vaccinated, or to, there was just a real honouring of people where they were at. And these women described these gatherings as a lifeline during lockdown. And this idea that these women, they refused to sort of buy into colonial narratives about prescribed ways of being in the pandemic, and they supported each other, even, with all their sort of difference and different opinions. And people were making herbal remedies for each other and talking about, their experience of their homelands and how they were sort of bringing ritualistic practice into their day-to-day life. So how they were singing to their children in their mother tongue at night, and how that was soothing them during this, time that was so intense. And children were at the heart of these gatherings, and there was a real sense that mothers were sort of honouring the complexity of how do you meet your own needs whilst homeschooling and caring for your children. And so in this new economy of care, the dark mother, the fallible human mother, the understanding that families are deeply connected systems affected by colonial, capitalist, patriarchal sort of narratives, all of this was central. So in this sort of remembering and honouring of the subjectivities of marginalised mothers, connecting with their enfleshed cultural and ancestral knowledge, it really highlighted the pluralities of well-being and how important it is to self-define well-being and healing, and how this needs to come into public policy making, and how women from the margins need to see their well-being as a force for political change, and have local government support and infrastructure to actually bring these things into public sort of policy and agendas. And one of the things that felt so important was that meeting on country, this connection to land, how healing that was, and how taking care outside of sort of clinical settings, connecting with more than human elements, how sort of restorative that was. And I just want to read a quote from Sarah, actually, from Sarah Motter, and then just to say that sort of new economies of care need to have health, well-being, vibrancy outside of Western biomedicine, which are embedded in knowledge that is deeply relational and indicates modes of responsibility to each other, to our ancestors and the earth. And that by recuperating such knowledges, we recuperate relationships between grandmothers, mothers, daughters, sisters, and aunties. And that this is a reweaving of the network of relationships, the spider webs with which we can hold each other, and that through these pluralities of health, we're developing both practices alternative to and in dialogue with certain Western biomedical practice to heal the traumas and bring back vibrancy and well-being to the territories of the earth, the body, and ourselves. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, that's beautiful.
Sorry.
Thank you, it's so lovely. So let's move on to whoever Mifano or Visco would like to go next.
Thank you, Kumari. I will focus on the colonial feminist because this is the approach that I like to explore more and invite everyone here to explore more, because the colonial feminism invites us to look at racial, gender, and socio-geographical inequalities. So it's a way to see and explore the world, looking at different layers, the different layers and the complexities in which we are living now. And these complexities involved many of the injustice and discrimination that we see nowadays. So the complexities are present, but they have a history. And this is a history of colonialism and coloniality that shapes how we understand the world in terms of people's hierarchies. And as Kumari and Kamaji have mentioned, these are basically thoughts that allows us to see the world as some people are more important than others, their knowledge is more important than other knowledge. So for me, is central for this struggle, is central for us to recognize that there have been injustice, the kind of epistemological injustice that many of the colonial feminists talk about. So is the idea that by recognizing some knowledge more important than others, we have seen, they call it epistemicide. So how ancestral knowledge is destroyed in the name of modern universal knowledge. And this idea just is reproduced in the university, is reproduced anywhere. So projects to decolonize knowledge demystify these ways of knowing the world that privilege the measurable, the visible, what is material, always as true, and includes other dimensions. And I think these dimensions is what makes the project possible, because women includes other visions, other ideas. And basically, I think my vision of how new feminist methodologies or feminist decolonized economies value more women's labor is by introducing this invisible knowledge and positioning this knowledge in a more horizontal way. In other words, recognizing the coexistence of multiple ways of knowing without invalidation. So it's the knowing of the mother, of the indigenous woman, is the knowledge that we have, but has been always repressed and always put in the second level. So by expanding our networks, we can share more this knowledge recognize this knowledge as important, as valuable, as meaningful. And in this way, we can also create more collaboration and more, I think very important is what Kamaris mentioned, the kind of network that allows us to create solidarity as well. So support for women. And if we have to gather together, it's good to have another person who can take care of the children for a while. It could be possible to share herbs and medicine that allows us to remember what our grandmothers tell us in the past. So it's not to just go to the pharmacy and buy something. We can have the herbs at home. And this kind of networks create possibilities for other economy and for other way to understand the world. And this is the task that we have, because for me, it's not the kind of the two paradigms that we have, like the socialist and the capitalist. We try to create another alternative, and this alternative can have more sense of humanity and more sense of who we are. And mothers are mothers of men and women. So we recognize this diversity. And this is my answer. And now I give the word to Mifa.
Thanks for very much, Biscay. Again, you've all sort of said things which have fired off a number of things. I guess I'll just start with a comment. It might seem a bit random, but I got engaged in a Facebook debate on like a comment on the Age newspaper, and I normally never comment on that, but it was about a neighbouring council, Moreland, which the name is linked to a kind of slavery through sugar ownership, plantation, and that they were thinking of changing it. And I made a simple comment of perhaps we could look at the Indigenous name, and of course I was bombarded with messages about being woke and everything you can imagine, really, and how a lot of people were saying we can't have this cancel culture, we've got to respect histories. And it struck me, and I said then, colonialism is the ultimate in cancel culture, because that's exactly what the kind of the mission was. It cancelled out Indigenous and feminized knowledges. That's exactly what it did, and it reordered the world and it commodified the world. So I think now that I was quite pleased with myself, because it's given me an answer to all those cancel culture people that are always kind of using that as an argument, because of course culture does change and it does improve, and and it goes on in its very many forms. And I just wanted to, the other thing that just reminded me was when Kamari was quoting from Sarah's book, and again that focuses on something which I've written about in previous work I've done around co-care and kind of mutual housing for older women as a way of kind of supporting each other. And I've done quite a lot around aged care, for men and women. And what is really important there is not what we, our kind of defining message of person-centered care, because what older people want is relationship-centered care. They're not so focused on, for those of you who know my aged care, it's all about tasks and units of care. It's not about, what most of the older people I've worked with want. It's the consistency of the relationship and someone they can trust and talk to and go to and ask questions. So it's not just having the shower every 2 days, support to have that. It is about the relationship. And I guess this sort of, this takes me back to what I said about my research, which seemed to suggest that in the kind of the labour forces we have it now, those relationships, for whatever reason, and a big reason is burnout for women, because we're doing the paid work, then we're finishing up, we're doing the unpaid work. Another thing which is really stands out for me is the nature of so many women working part-time, and I tried to do some research into it. there's very little, very little, and it might be something I look at in the future. But essentially, I know from my own personal experience and much anecdotal experience that when you move into part-time work, often after having children and, you know, having a small gap off, you know, you might apply for a full-time job, and, you know, we work flexibly, we'll fit you in, and so that they reduce your hours, but your position description and your tasks, your responsibilities stay exactly the same. So there's an immense pressure for women who are working part-time to keep up and have the same amount of outputs as women who are working full-time. And you know, one of the core things shown in the NHS study into workplace bullying was a lot of that was around perceived workload burden and differences in burden. So I think that there's a whole lot of pressures around burnout, workload, you know, and that kind of, you know, the ambiguity about where work stops and where it begins. But having said all that, we were talking about our vision for the future, and, you know, I not particularly through this research project, but in previous work and as an ongoing side interest, I'm really fascinated by how COVID has exposed what Sarah mentioned about my interest in the introduction and what I like to think is a kind of a subversive localism creeping up. So, you know, as some of you may already know, you may not be on Facebook or other kind of platform monopolies as they are at the moment, but there's all kinds of local network groups. So certainly in Melbourne, we have something called the Good Karma Network. I don't know if that's national, but it's there's 37 Good Karma networks. There's one in my local area of Heidelberg. It's got over 5,000 people that belong to it in my local area. It's admin or almost all older women. So again, there's that older women working together, collaborating, and really it's a network, and it goes along. There's other ones. There's the transition movement, which I'm sure you all know. The kind of there's another one which is just about an exchange network. So they're different ways of working and sharing and living together as a community and networking. So you're sharing skills, time. You know, I've finished using these textbooks, you take them on. So it's a different kind of economy, and it's sort of in its own way, it's post money and it's local, and I love both those things. And the fact that it's largely female led, but men are involved. And I've just, you know, I've had some, it's very much thrived in my local area under COVID, and I believe that I think there's a real opportunity there, because I see that as, in some ways, it's not perfect, of course, but it encompasses many of the things that we've talked about already in terms of a kind of a feminized or Indigenous economy, which are around those building connections, around the localism, around the respect for diverse voices. It's about sustainability. So you see kind of formalized examples of it in the example of time banking. I don't know if any of you know that, but time banking was a kind of a Swiss initiative where people, so it's kind of like volunteering, but you can put in 10 hours helping your neighbour down the road and then claim credits back for that when you're older. So there's things like that. They've now introduced that in parts of the UK. So it's kind of like mutual credit models, sharing networks, platform networks. So, you know, these are the things which I've seen grow and thrive under COVID. So particularly in my local area, belonging to all these networks, of course, mainly partly as a resident, but partly as a nosy researcher type. You know, I've seen people say, my heating's broken, can anybody lend me this? I've come back from hospital, can anybody, you know, so really, you know, a lot of it was focused around care, reciprocity, kinship, you know, and I think that's, you know, COVID has really exposed the importance of the local. And again, around that and related to that, there was kind of food networks and the sustainability of producing what we really need and only consuming what we really need, and and bringing it back to the locals. So we've, COVID's exposed, the problematic nature of supply lines and global supply lines, food sufficiency, independency, being able to access the services you need. So for me, the vision for the future is very much cooperative, and it's about mutual organizations. So there are a lot already in the world, but they're under-resourced, and they find it very hard to kind of get up on, get up and started. So when I talk about the sharing economy, I guess people normally think of Uber, but that, as you can see, it's a very different thing, because it's not a cooperative in which everybody owns equal shares, and it doesn't follow the 7 principles of cooperatives, which I won't go into now. But it's what we call a platform economy. So it's a sharing economy like that. So there are models similar to that, but where people own a share in it to become a member. So the Uber drivers don't own Uber. Uber is a company which then kind of contracts out. But I do think there is a lot of a future in kind of platform cooperatives. The issue, of course, is that, and I'm not talking sort of can-do capitalism, quite the opposite, and kind of technical solutions, technocratic solutions to climate change, but really that, technology does allow us in some ways to connect locally in better ways. We need to come off Facebook and build our own software. And there's if anyone's interested, there's a good example in just outside Melbourne in a smaller satellite city called Bendigo, and they've got the Beehive model. They've got an app. They've set up their own software, so it's like a sharing platform, but it's not Facebook. So anyway, these kind of mainly Facebook groups have thrived, and for me, it is a kind of subversive localism. I love that it's female dominated, and there may be many reasons for that, women having more time and being in the home, and there's certainly a lot of men involved as well, and offering services to come and help doing kind of, traditional handyman services. So for me, that's something that COVID has shown as an alternative to the kind of patriarchal colonial capitalist authority. And I think it as well, it has scope to kind of bring in, it doesn't have to be based on technologies, but it still includes that kind of that kinship model, which is so integral to Indigenous knowledges, and traditionally how women used to work in groups, and it takes a village to raise a child and all that. And now we find ourselves pitted against each other in the commodification of ourselves as formerly as property of men, and now as property of the people in control of mainly leadership roles and things in care. So I hope that makes some sort of sense. But so I guess what I'm trying to say is local, convivial, sharing, and ideally, I believe there is, economy is a social construct. I think we could move beyond money. It doesn't have to be bartering, but I do think there are other ways, and there's some great diverse voices we could bring into bringing that forward. Thank you.
Thank you for a review. That's wonderful. I didn't want to stop anyone talking, so we have gone over a bit, but I just think it was really important just to allow the women to speak and to share, really, and just to allow all that to percolate, and we can kind of sit with it. These are some of the conversations and the mappings and the development of shared languages that we do with a mindfulness to how it might support our own practice in all the different areas that we work in, formally and informally, politically and socially, and in kinship wise. I did notice something about allyship earlier, but I've lost it in the chat, and I often talk about kinship actually, and kinship's come up quite a lot. So because we're at 12:30, we won't do the Padlet, we'll do some questions. And if people want to make any comments as well. So there was, I have noticed 3 in the chat, although there's lots of different bits going on. I've had private messages and things, people saying bye. But the 3 that I've identified, the first one was quite early on. And in many ways, we've kind of talked about it in maybe not in an essentialist sense of women, but maybe feminized folk and women who play certain roles. But this is an interesting one. So the first one came from Michelle Smith, and it was, I'm deeply concerned about the human relationship to nature. Do you think women are more likely than men to better care for the earth? So if any of you has any thoughts on this, please do share. Maybe just keep the thoughts a little bit short so we can have time if other people here would like to give any reflections as well.
I can quickly answer that one, Sarah. So there is evidence that in all the cultures that women are much more attached to nature than men. And that's why that brings us that multidimensional perspective in our thinking as well, to quite an extent. And I think giving a lot of capabilities. There have been lots of movements that's been started by women to protect nature. No doubt about that. So I can send some literature if you're interested in exploring more.
Brilliant. Anyone else would like to give any thoughts on that of the 4 of you?
I would just add, I mean, I absolutely agree with Kamaljit, but I would also add that, you know, traditionally acknowledges that it's a little bit problematic, the aligning of the feminine with nature, and that is a little bit contested, and it has been used in patriarchal discourse to you know, to undermine our practices and our way of thinking. And you know, obviously it's something that's also aligned with narratives about individual knowledges. So I think you know, I think it's something to be proud of, and it's great, Kamaljit, that you say there is that evidence, because I hadn't really heard that. So that's something I'm going to be shouting about. But at the same time, you know, I know a lot of fantastic men working in kind of sustainability and driving these things as well, and who are also very you know, passionate and great listeners to diverse voices and bring their own skills and knowledge. So I would like to just, I do think it's patriarchy more than men that is about extractivism and destruction and commodification.
Yeah, there's some chat going on. It's so interesting. The decolonial feminism, just because I work with that a lot as well, is often it's talking about racialized and feminized, and it shows how Black men and Indigenous men have also, through the histories of slavery and dispossession, have been feminized and treated as objects. So there's a real playing with binaries as well, that are allowed by a decolonial or Black feminist lens, which is also something we explore and we mess up a bit, as well as then honouring also the kinds of things that Kamaljit and Mofin have also been said. Yeah, so yeah, I like this. It's very pluridiverse, and I think that's the generative nature of what we're doing. I think it's really beautiful what people said. So I did miss one from Sue. So Sue had a question, which was, I'm a privileged older white woman with a disability who is fascinated with the etymology of words and the power of language and its ability to perpetuate othering. I read an article recently rejecting the terminology of allies accomplices, preferring the term co-belligerent. Can I ask women what they think of that term, or if they have another preferred word? I can put it back into the text as well, so that you can see this question, because it came right at the beginning. Sue, so if any of you have any comments on that, put it in there. Sue, are you still here? Like, did you mean that in terms of like racialized allyship, or did you mean that in terms of men and women in feminist struggle? What did you mean by that? I can see you here. Are you typing? Ah, men and women and allyship. Okay. Any of you have reflections on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm exactly clear what Sue is referring to, so I'll
Can
hand
I
that to-
speak?
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. In describing myself, I guess I'm talking about, I don't want to say supporter, because that's, I don't know, that has all sorts of connotations. But I want to be part of. So but as a white woman, I can't say that. Yeah, I can say I want to be part of, but you know, I need a name, a word that describes people working together, all of us being together.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm going to pop in as no one else has. I'm not quite sure about the term co-belligerent. It strikes me as there's just something negative in it, although it's quite active. I just wonder if there are other terms. I suppose, I mean, I work in the LGBTIQ plus space, so I refer to myself as an ally. But, you know, there's no term that isn't in a way slightly problematic. And I think, I don't know, language is evolving, and co-belligerent, I quite like that. I might test it out and see how that goes at my next meeting.
We actually do work on this. I do work on this, and across different indigeneities and different Blackness, but also across the intersectionalities of womanhood, as in white womanhood and Black womanhood. And for me, it's always placed and about relationality. And it's about the languages we form together to make sense of the kinds of co-responsibilities and unlearnings where necessary, and accountabilities, the differential accountabilities, but also the places that we might have things in common. So something that with women in their plurality that I've worked with here, we're using a lot kinship. But of course, it's not just a word, it's a relationship. So it's about a relationship of care. It's about a relationship of responsibility. So I will give one example. She comes from a white middle class background, but she works a lot with Indigenous folk and with myself and other trans Indigenous. And she talks about herself as unlearning some of the elements of settler whiteness, and in doing so having responsibility. So for example, if there are kind of micro-violences, racialized, feminized micro-violences in a space we're in together, so that I or others don't have to get re-traumatized, she will sometimes speak or do that labor to explain things that otherwise I'm exhausted, I can't, I'm sharing, sorry, because we do actually work on this stuff, for example, or at the same time as we sit in circle also with Ibiske to share the grandmother's knowledges about herbs. Because we're all reclaiming in some ways lost fragments in differing ways of sometimes dispossession, sometimes through settler invasion, you know, so there's complexities in that. So, and that becomes, and we care for each other's children, and our children are together and are learning together about the complexities of this system. So yeah, for us, it's become kinship, but we've made sense of a language, and that language is living, you know, and in other contexts, maybe ally works because that implies something a little bit more distance and a certain separateness, and it's a particular place tradition, as is the other one, accomplice. It's quite from the States, Turtle Island. So I think that these things are worked in our relating and our sharing of stories, and sometimes having those uncomfortable moments and learnings together. That would be my experience, just to drop in there.
Can I say something?
Of course. Yeah.
All right. Sorry, I had to run off. I got a very important call, but so I'm not sure if I'm coming in at the right time. But is this about the women being nurturing of nature more than men? Are we still there?
Oh no, we've moved to kind of allies or relationships across difference, but you can talk about nature. You can drop in whatever you'd like to drop in.
Ah, well, it's not so much about nature as the difference between men and women, as in women with the womb as opposed to women who have become women or changed. And I guess we each have innate behaviors which can never be our innate behaviors as men and women, or male and female, will always be a part of who we are, and it's actually impossible to get rid of them. So it's always going to have a part with the decisions we make and how we behave. But of course, you cannot say that if you're a woman or a female, you're going to be like this, just as you cannot say if you're a man, you're going to be like this. But it's just something to consider. It all comes down, I believe, to, I guess, the chemistry as we grow and our brains develop, and the chemistry that becomes a large part of who we are as individuals. A woman may be more male-like in their thinking and vice versa. But I also, well, I was listening earlier on, and I must say, I do tend to say things that people get upset about because I don't have a certain understanding or way of thinking. So sometimes I can come across as being upsetting, but it's just because I think maybe a bit differently. I'm a very logical thinker. I don't think of anything other than what to me is logical or what makes sense, and I tend not to consider anything else. But I don't know about anybody else here, but I was brought up in a first world country. We moved around the world. We lived in places where people had to have a gun in order to survive, but it was still a first world country in space. I haven't been brought up in third world country or space where women do have to work together to survive. So I've been brought up in a first world where women often like to take other women out or get rid of them because of competition, as opposed to women who need each other and support each other so that they can live and survive, because the men don't have that and they don't give that. I think that's something that we need to all consider when making a judgment or taking things into consideration, is that how were you brought up? Were you brought up in a third world country? Did you not have certain things that are stable to other people? And comparing that to a woman or groups of women who have been brought up where they have everything that they need, and so therefore they don't necessarily need the other women to help them out, or you don't need each other as women or females to get through certain things. And so because of your innate behavior, it turns the table and the other women become competitors, because we all have eggs, and innate behavior is for women to have children. So to get rid of the other women, it almost puts you as the top, the top seeder, so to speak, or the top woman. So you maintain that control you maintain that control in that situation, as opposed to working together with other women so that you can each survive. And I just think that's the most interesting and fascinating thing, looking at the whole as a total comparison. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, but very rarely have I no, that doesn't make sense. Very rarely have I heard that being spoken about. I don't know if it's taboo. Yep.
Can I have say something?
Yes, good to hear many voices. Thank you, Maggie, for your reflections there.
Well, yeah, I'm Eva Cox, and I'm a sort of well-known. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. And I'm a long-term active feminist and been very much involved in things. And I've been sitting here listening, quite interested, because one of the things that's been puzzling me for a very long time is how we actually get the shift back so that the male stuff is no longer everything that's public and important and monetized, and female stuff is all that other stuff that sort of somehow or other got divided in the Industrial Revolution and packed off to the home so it wasn't valued. And I think even though, you know, I'm really interested in the stuff that's come up, and particularly what Mifem's been talking about with the things, you know, these collectives and various other groups. They've been there for a long time. I'm old enough to remember when we had the rush in the 1970s, when everybody sort of took off into co-ops and various other sorts of things. But we've never really addressed, and that's what I'm quite interested in. In fact, I mean, I've actually said before, I don't think economics is reformable because it deals with the material, it deals with the monetized, it deals with the things that, and all the things that really affect women, and not only women, and the colonization and the different cultures are sort of referred to as externalities and dismissed. I want to have a system where we can talk about ethics. I want a system where we can talk about cultural differences, where we can recognize diversity and all of those things which are not counted in economics, and they don't turn up whether they're Marxist or market forces. So I think we really do need to try and have a much bigger push than just organize at the local level, because as soon as you get up to the upper level where the decisions are being made and the political stuff happens, a lot of those groups just end up losing ground because they funded some bloody sort of organization to sort of run a commercial organization. There you can see what's happening with aged care and various other areas. And I think, and I mean, I've had this argument, as I say, with the NENA people before, that we need to actually start talking seriously about the fact that the world consists of a diversity of gender things, quite apart from everything else, which we haven't sort of really come across. And I don't think we're born to be women or born to be men, as somebody was sort of commenting on. I think we all have a whole lot of very diverse things. And I'm a sociologist, so I believe it's a social that turns out, you know, that really reinforces who we are. We need to change the way that we bring up boys to be tough and girls to be nice. I know I always get into trouble because I'm a non-nice woman. Sometimes I'm known to swear and various other things. But I think we've got to start a serious discussion about what a society is, because the whole idea of the social has dropped right out of the political agenda. One of the things I've been thinking of doing and have had a few attempts at is to try and say that what we need is a social contract. We sort of had one during the post-war period. I'm old, I can remember about this. I was a refugee from Hitler to the age of about 5 weeks because my parents are Jewish and I was born in Vienna. So I grew up with a puzzlement as to how we actually ended up with things like Nazis and how we're still ending up with these top-down, extraordinarily thing there and how they'll divide us. And I've also, you know, done a fair bit of work around First Nation type people and various other types of things. But we need to sort of get back to the fact that a society is what counts, not an economy. An economy is an exchange system. It's a monetized system. It's becoming, I mean, money, we're getting rid of cash, you know, so it's becoming even more abstract. We're changing with technology and various other things. But what we don't have, and what I'd really like NENA to sort of think about, is how do we get to the fact that we want to put the society back on the agenda? We're social beings. We're dependent for a very long time. If we weren't social beings, we wouldn't survive. And yet all of that stuff's sort of ignored because it's womanized. It's sort of seen as soft and female and not really important. And only when you get a paid job or you count it. We've got nothing about unpaid work. And I think we really do need to look at the way that unpaid work actually holds society together. And I think, you know, what we've just been through with COVID makes that very clear. And it's part of what you're talking about, and it's part of what we talk about if we're talking about First Nation stuff, because they didn't even have money. They didn't even have a counting system past 5, but they managed all sorts of complex issues, like working out a whole lot of things about distance and things without it. So why are we sort of stuck with this idea that sort of we've got to put everything in monetized terms? I just think we need to put society back and drive it by feminism, because almost all the groups around have females in them and have the same diminution. And the diminution has come out of Western civilization. And I think we need to fix it. But I think we need a bit of big picture stuff as well as the small picture stuff, because the small picture stuff, you know, I've been around in this area for over 50 years. It disappears after a while. I can tell you what's disappeared in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And that's why we're in the mess we're in.
Mm.
So, I mean, I'm really interested if people are interested in sort of trying to put the big stuff in as the small stuff as well.
I think, you know, I mean, this is wonderful. This is so hard being not together in space in a bloody circle, where we can really work with how we listen to each other, right? And the space we give and the ways that we create the space to listen and deeply listen. Whereas here we have to do it one by one, but there's richness, even if there's tension, right? And that's okay, like how we navigate tension. But I think that if I'm talking, the way we're mapping the economy in this expanded sense is not to economize everything, but to decolonize and humanize and feminize everything in terms of value, actually. This reimagining of value and well-being and the kinds of linkages and relationships that allow social reproduction and the reproduction of life and life bringing.
I mean, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I think you can do it under an economic label, because the whole economic
well, we're playing, right? We're disrupting. I think that's part of what it's doing. But I think these bits are not, I wouldn't say that what the women have been saying today is that the bits are separate from those questions, but are the way you rebuild building blocks.
Sort of bottom up.
Sorry, I think, but I'll let them answer, because I think Eva's kind of question, which is a strategic, how do you shift, links a bit with JP who left, her question, which was also like kind of similar. What is your sense of what else might effectively transform the marginalization and the commodification of care in our cultures? So it's a bit of a value question, care. So if the four of you, because time is running out, if you'd like to maybe each comment on that, about these strategic questions and these political kind of economic social questions, that would be amazing, I think, to end on.
Look, I'm happy to quickly jump in and say, you know, with a background in policy, I think there is a shift to talking about well-being economies, and, you know, a shift away from growth and GDP, which Kamaljit mentioned earlier. And I remember hearing recently, and it may not be right, but I think it's the US, which has the highest GDP in the world, has the least records of the most unhappy people, whereas Guatemala, which has one of the lowest GDP rates in the world, has the highest levels of happiness. So I think people are really starting to think more, and COVID has provided this opportunity, as we've seen with the mass resignations of people. People are moving away from the CBDs. You know, men are wanting to spend more time with children. So I do see the shifts towards, you know, the World Health Organization has just, you know, recognized burnout as a specific condition. So people are kind of shifting away from meaningless work and thinking, you know, why are we on here? Why are we continuing? Why are we continuing to grow? Can do capitalism again, destroying the planet, destroying our well-being. So I think the seeds are there, but you know, Eva and everybody's absolutely right. We've got to battle ahead.
Can I just say the seeds were there in the 1970s and they got run over by neoliberalism, and I'm not, and that's why I think we need a more, you know, the top and bottom moving. It's moving across the system rather than just fixing the care stuff from below, you know.
Yes, look, I would agree, and I'll be quiet after this last comment, but I'm increasingly away from the two-party political system. They, you know, both those key parties support work and growth, and I don't think that's the way forward for me. So I'll be quiet there.
Can I just put one extra word in to think about it there, because I'd love to sort of continue a discussion on that. What I want to do at the moment is the UN Women has just put out a very long, complex paper on creating a feminist social contract. And it's well worth looking up. You'll find it on somewhere on the UN type things. Social Europe has also done that. I think we need to sort of pull a lot of this stuff together and start talking about, until we have a social contract, the distrust of government that we've got at the moment that is breeding all sorts of crap, is because people don't see democracy as being social democracy. It's liberal democracy. It's about individualism. And I think if we talk about a social contract, we can actually start restoring some faith in the fact that democracy works.
Wonderful. So thank you. So let's do the last, Ebiske, Kamari and Kamaljit, if you would like to add some final words. I'm very mindful of time now.
I'll be very quick, Sarah. Eva, totally agree with you. I think we need to, have that social reconstruct. But coming back to like when we think about our economy, so when you try to picture it, because we created that economy, isn't it, for running our lives smooth. So in a bigger picture, if you try to picturize in your mind, so we got the nature systems, so natural systems. So we got our society embedded within that natural system, and then we got economy embedded within that system. And within that economy, there is a particular section of economy that just deals with well-being economy. It's not about monetization. But because since our industrialization and because of our focus on GDP, we have completely forgotten about the ethics in economy, about those moral values in economy. We have just become about, commodification and, enhancing our GDP, which is not the way to sustain on this planet Earth either. So I think to move forward, we need both. We also need to change our economy, and we also need to bring those changes in our society. That transformation is needed on both sides to bring this change faster rather than being slow. And I think women coming from this multiple dimensional perspective can be really critical, both maintaining the societal structure and transforming that society, and also transforming the economy, because they see economy in a different way, like the economy for caring, or the way we look after nature, one way or the other. So we do have a bit of responsibility there. That's how I see it. If we want to bring that transformation both in society and economy, training our children to be in that space, I think is our first responsibility. And then expanding on to our, near and dear by those spheres could be another way. I'm looking for solutions like, how can we bring it faster rather than delaying it too much?
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you. And Ibiska, I'm going to move to you, Ibiska, if you'd like to give a few comments.
No, I have more questions than answers and comments.
Lovely.
I think maybe I understand what Kumaji mentions, because maybe people like comes from the South and underdeveloped countries, and we can understand the importance of the resources and the importance of the economy, not in the terms of monetary, not in the terms of capitalism, but in the terms that is necessary for survival. And I think the idea is to change that economy, to change the dominant way of understanding economic competition, the neoliberal paradigm and liberal paradigm on the economy. So I think this is the task, and we have to keep exploring more and more and create this new economy.
And then,
thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, that's all right. And then with Kumari.
I was just thinking that there are so many ways to weave a fabric of this sort of new economy, and that the things that we've been talking about, and that when women and racialized women and queer women are getting in sort of touch with their own sort of sovereignty, that which then can't be unknown. And then that, I think that the small changes that, and Eva, you talked about, the seeds of change that you saw in the 60s and the 70s. I feel that these are the changes that have sort of ricocheted through, and that, of course, we want sort of policy to change, and we want our enfleshed experiences to impact on policy. But I feel that what we're doing in kinship networks, the changes that we're sort of feeling viscerally, that, that the tide is changing. This is causing change at so many different levels. And maybe even though, it can't be seen at sort of governmental level, I don't think it means that things aren't working. I think that change and reweaving happens in different ways. So yeah, thank you.
Beautiful, thank you so much. We've reached the end now today. I would like to invite any of you. There's obviously a lot here and there's a lot of difference and you know, these sticky points too in that difference, and they're important to acknowledge and to, where possible, work through together. So I would invite any of you who aren't already in our hub, the Women in the New Economy, and hopefully you've got a sense of how diverse and plural this is, these terms and the languages and practices that we're creating and the readings and strategic kind of understandings and support care between us is. So I'd invite you to, you can send me an email or send the main NENA an email saying that you're interested to participate. Some of our big themes is to carry on with this and maybe produce something together, but also we're focusing a lot on housing and intersectional gendered analysis and strategy around housing, because quite a few of us are in our own particular places trying to forge forward women-led co-housings or other forms of kinship. So please do join us, and if you didn't have time to share your thoughts, please feel free to also write them, send an email, you know, and come along and join us. And thank you so much to the 4 women who presented with your wisdoms and your pluridiverse wisdoms to mess up things too, to mess up easy, simple understandings of what it might mean to think of a feminized, decolonized or feminist economy, or even what the economy is. I really value that. I think it's beautiful, and I think there is so much wisdom just from here. I was listening to you thinking the layers and the depth is incredible, and yeah, I really honor that. And I also honor everybody that participated and that contributed and that listened. Listening is just as vital as speaking if we want to create the space and the possibilities for these pluridiverse, feminized, decolonized economies. So thank you so much, and maybe we will see you in one of our hub meetings or another event with NENA. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Sarah.
Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for
What are
listening.
you doing there, NENA?
And the recordings will be available on the NENA website next week. Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Sarah, for facilitating. Thanks to all the speakers.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody.